All right, so let's dive into something kind of different today, something fascinating. We're going to explore a what-if scenario.
Okay.
And imagine a world where either Hillary Clinton won back in 2016
Hmm.
or Kamala Harris took down Trump in a 2024 comeback bid.
Interesting.
Now, we're not trying to rewrite history or anything like that, but using your expert analysis and these sources,
Yeah.
we're going to try to understand how things might have been different, not just politically, but for the economy, global leadership, even social issues.
You know what's so intriguing about this?
Yeah.
Is that by looking at these alternate histories, we can better grasp the forces that shape our world, even the one we're actually in. You know, it helps us analyze the choices that were made, paths not taken,
Right.
and the impact of who sits in the Oval Office.
It's like holding up a mirror to our own reality in a way.
Exactly.
So let's start with something that affects everyone, the economy. Our sources point to some pretty stark contrasts between the economic visions of a Clinton or Harris presidency versus a Trump presidency.
Yeah.
What stands out to you?
Well, I think the biggest difference is the level of government involvement.
Okay.
A Clinton or Harris presidency likely means a continuation of public investment. So think infrastructure, green energy, high-tech manufacturing.
So building on things like the CHIPS Act and the Inflation Reduction Act.
Exactly. Federal support for new factories, clean energy jobs, training programs, that sort of thing.
Okay, so a more hands-on approach from the government.
Yeah.
But wouldn't businesses be wary of that kind of intervention?
It depends on the business. You know,
Okay.
some businesses thrive on predictability, knowing that the rules of the game will stay relatively consistent.
Right.
And that's what Clinton or Harris likely offer, a stable environment for long-term growth. Now, with Trump, you're potentially looking at a boom and bust cycle.
Because of his focus on tax cuts and deregulation?
Exactly. He viewed those as the keys to unlocking rapid growth. Imagine maybe even more tax cuts than we saw in his first term,
Wow.
possibly extending to the middle class, plus slashing business regulations.
So short-term gains are definitely possible under that scenario.
Oh, absolutely. Short-term gains are on the table, but at what cost?
It sounds like businesses would need to be very agile, ready to adapt to those sudden shifts in policy.
For sure.
And speaking of shifts, we can't ignore trade, especially with China.
Right.
Such a hot-button issue during Trump's first term.
It was.
How would things look different under a Clinton or Harris administration?
While all sides acknowledge China as a competitor,
Right.
the approach is key. Clinton or Harris would likely maintain a tough stance,
Yeah.
but favor strategic collaboration.
More of a work with allies strategy.
Exactly. And remember, Harris criticized Trump's tariffs for hurting U.S. consumers.
She did.
It suggests a move towards easing those tariffs, lowering costs for both businesses and everyday folks like you.
So less of a trade war and more of a focus on working with allies to address the challenges posed by China.
That's right.
That's a pretty stark contrast to Trump potentially doubling down on tariffs and restrictions.
It is. And while that might temporarily protect some domestic industries, many economists argue it ultimately hurts U.S. manufacturing and farming.
Okay.
Think back to the trade war of 2018 and 2019. Retaliation hurts everyone.
Yeah.
You'd see that reflected in prices, job security, the whole 9 yards.
So Clinton or Harris mean more stability, even if it's not as flashy as a sudden boom.
Yeah.
It's about long-term planning versus reacting to those sudden market swings.
That's a good way to put it. And this extends to energy, too.
Okay.
Clinton or Harris prioritize clean energy, investing heavily in those jobs.
So imagine continued subsidies for electric vehicles, one solar, all the things aiming for a greener future.
Precisely.
But wouldn't that risk leaving behind workers in traditional energy sectors like oil and gas?
It's a trade-off, no doubt.
Yeah.
Under Trump, it's highly likely we'd see a push for fossil fuel expansion,
Yeah.
opening up more land for rolling back environmental regulations, all framed as boosting energy independence and those blue-collar jobs.
Lower energy prices in the short term sound appealing.
They do.
But what about the long-term cost to the environment, to the global shift towards renewables?
You're raising a really interesting point. It's not just about what's good for the economy today, but what kind of economy we're building for tomorrow.
And on that note, let's shift gears to foreign policy, where things get particularly interesting.
Okay, let's do it. Welcome back to our deep dive.
Okay, so as we move into this next part, I think it's important to remember
Yeah.
we're not just speculating for fun here.
Right.
We're using these hypothetical scenarios to really understand how different choices ripple outward, shaping not just U.S. policy, but the world you live in.
It affects all of us.
It does. It's like we're peeking into alternate timelines.
Yeah, I like that.
And what really strikes me is how much impact a president has on that global stage.
That's true.
By 2024, the world was facing some serious issues.
Oh, yeah?
Climate change, China's rise, the whole AI revolution.
Huge challenges.
How would a Clinton or Harris presidency have navigated all of that?
Well, let's take climate change first.
Okay.
The U.S. and China, as the biggest emitters, hold a lot of power.
Great.
Under Clinton or Harris, you'd likely see the U.S. leading global efforts, building on existing agreements, and pushing for even greater cooperation to reduce emissions.
Which makes sense because going it alone on climate change doesn't really solve the problem, does it?
No, not at all. It's a global issue that requires global solutions.
Right.
But with Trump, there's a strong chance we'd see the opposite, a potential undermining of those global efforts. Remember, he already pulled the U.S. out of the Paris Agreement once.
Yeah, he did.
Imagine the impact on the fight against climate change if that happened again.
It would be a major setback.
It would be a blow to international cooperation and a setback for the planet as a whole.
So on one hand, you have the U.S. leading the charge, working with allies.
Right.
On the other hand, it's potentially going rogue, much to the detriment of the global environment.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
And what about something like AI?
Okay.
That's a technology that's impacting everyone everywhere.
AI is a great example of something that needs international cooperation to manage effectively. Under Clinton or Harris, you'd likely see the U.S. working with allies to establish global norms regulations. Basically the rules of the road for responsible AI development.
Because it's like the Wild West right now, isn't it?
It is. Each country doing its own thing.
Right.
But with Trump, there's a good chance we'd see a more America-first approach, prioritizing U.S. dominance without much regard for international consensus. Imagine a world where different countries are developing AI along conflicting paths.
Like to get messy.
It could become a very unstable and unpredictable landscape with implications for everyone, from tech companies to everyday users.
So it's almost like we're choosing between a global collaborative approach and a more fragmented competitive one.
That's a good way to frame it.
And that brings us to China, another huge player on the world stage. Clinton and Harris seem likely to continue viewing China as a competitor, but one they'd engage with strategically.
Exactly. Recognizing both the challenges and the opportunities,
Okay.
they'd likely prioritize cooperation on issues of mutual interest.
Like what?
Think climate change, global trade.
Right.
But with Trump, you'd likely see a continuation of the trade war and even more confrontational rhetoric.
Because, remember, his focus on the trade deficit and accusations of unfair practices?
Exactly. He took a very hard line on China.
He did. It feels like with Trump, the focus is almost entirely economic.
Yeah.
Without much thought given to the broader geopolitical implications.
That's a fair point.
But wouldn't a more aggressive stance towards China appeal to those who see them as a threat?
It might in the short term.
Okay.
But imagine the potential consequences increased tensions in the South China Sea conflict over Taiwan.
Right.
It could even draw the U.S. into a military confrontation, something no one wants.
That's a scary thought.
It is. Managing the U.S.-China relationship is a delicate balancing act.
Yeah.
And a solely aggressive approach could easily backfire.
So it's about choosing between a carefully calibrated strategy and a potentially volatile one.
I think that's a good summary.
And what about America's role as a defender of democracy and human rights globally?
Okay.
Would that change under each scenario?
That's a crucial point.
Yeah.
With Clinton or Harris, you might see continued, though, selective championing of democracy and human rights.
Okay.
Think continued pressure on authoritarian regimes, like Putin's Russia.
Okay.
Stronger coordination among democracies to tackle shared problems.
It's the classic image of America as the leader of the free world, right?
Exactly. But with Trump, his America First agenda signals a potential retreat from that role. He's shown admiration for strongman leaders and seems less interested in promoting democracy abroad.
Yeah.
A second term could accelerate this trend, creating a global leadership vacuum.
And who feels that vacuum matters, doesn't it?
It does.
If it's not the U.S. promoting democratic values, other countries perhaps with less than democratic aims might step in.
That's the risk.
It makes you think about the ripple effect of American choices on the global stage.
It does. These choices have consequences that extend far beyond U.S. borders.
They do. And that brings us back to the domestic front, where those choices also have long-lasting effects.
Right.
Let's consider how these hypothetical presidencies might shape American society in the long run. Okay, so we've journeyed through these alternate timelines,
Yeah.
exploring how different presidential choices could have shaped the world we live in.
It's been quite a ride.
It
Yeah.
has. Now let's zoom out and consider the big picture,
Right.
the lasting legacies of these what-if scenarios.
The long game.
The long game. What's so fascinating is that this exercise forces us to think beyond the immediacy of elections.
Right.
We're looking at the ripple effects of decisions that stretch years, even decades into the future.
It's like we've been playing a game of political chess, and now we're analyzing the end game.
Exactly. What kind of board would we be left with under each of these presidencies?
Well, let's start with the economy. Under Clinton or Harris, we might see a continuation of trends from the Obama and Biden years.
Okay.
Imagine a focus on government investment social programs, a gradual shift towards a more sustainable and equitable economy.
That sounds appealing to those who believe in a more active role for government.
Yeah,
But wouldn't there be pushback from those who favor a more hands-off approach?
absolutely. There would be ongoing debates about the size and scope of government, the role of regulation,
Uh-huh.
finding that balance between economic growth and social equity.
It's a constant tug of war.
It is. These are fundamental questions every society grapples with, no matter who's in charge.
Right.
You as a citizen would be part of that conversation,
Duh.
weighing in on what you think is the best path forward.
So even in this alternate timeline, we'd still be wrestling with these core economic questions.
For sure.
Now, with Trump, his focus was very much on tax cuts, deregulation, protectionist trade policies.
Right.
What kind of long-term economic landscape would that create?
Well, think of it this way. Trump's policies could lead to a more volatile economy.
Okay.
Short-term gains for some, sure, especially corporations and the wealthy,
Right.
but it also carries the risk of deepening inequality, increasing national debt, and potentially hurting the U.S. economy's ability to compete globally in the long run.
So a bit of a gamble, a potential boom, but also the risk of a bust that could affect everyone.
Exactly. And it highlights why it's crucial to think about who benefits from economic policies, not just in the immediate future, but over the long haul.
It's about the long game.
It is. What kind of economy do we want to build for ourselves, for our children? These are questions worth pondering.
They are. Let's turn our attention to social and cultural trends.
Okay.
Under Clinton or Harris, it seems likely we'd see a continued push for inclusivity and social justice.
Yeah.
What would that look like in practice?
Imagine sustained efforts to address systemic racism, promote LGBTQ+ rights, protect reproductive rights,
Okay.
a society that's striving to be more equitable and just rich.
But wouldn't those efforts face resistance? Social change often creates friction.
Of course. Progress on social issues often triggers a backlash.
Right.
You can expect pushback from those who feel threatened by these changes, leading to a continued battle for social justice, perhaps even more intense than what we've seen.
So even in a world where Clinton or Harris win, the fight for equality wouldn't be over.
Not at all.
What about with Trump? His rhetoric and policies often appeal to those who felt left behind by social and cultural shifts.
Right.
How might that play out over time?
Well, Trump tapped into a sense of resentment and anxiety among certain groups.
Okay.
Those who felt their values and way of life were under attack.
Yeah.
A second term could embolden those views, leading to a more divided and polarized social climate.
So under Trump, there's the potential for these divisions to become even more entrenched, making it harder to find common ground.
That's a real possibility.
Yeah.
And it raises an important question for all of us.
What?
How do we bridge these divides? How do we create a society where everyone feels seen and heard, even when we disagree?
It's a challenge we need to face regardless of who's in office.
They agree.
Now, throughout this deep dive, we've talked about the potential impacts on the economy, on social issues, on global affairs.
Right.
But what about the very fabric of American democracy? How might each of these hypothetical presidencies shape that?
Okay, well, under Clinton or Harris, there's the potential for a gradual rebuilding of trust in government and democratic institutions.
Okay.
Their commitment to democratic norms, their respect for the rule of law.
Yeah.
These could help restore some of the faith that's been eroded in recent years.
So a chance to heal some of the wounds and move towards a more functional, less volatile political environment.
It's possible, but it's a fragile process that would require effort from everyone.
Right.
It wouldn't just be about who sits in the Oval Office. It would be about how we as citizens engage with each other and with our government. Do we choose to bridge divides or widen them?
That sense of responsibility is something we've touched on throughout this deep dive.
It's a crucial point.
Now, with Trump, his actions, particularly his efforts to overturn the 2020 election, did a lot of damage to those democratic norms and institutions.
Yeah, no doubt about it.
And a second term could have amplified that damage.
Imagine a world where disregard for norms becomes even more normalized.
It's a scary thought.
It is. Where the very foundations of our democracy are further weakened. It's a sobering thought.
It makes you realize that democracy isn't something we can take for granted.
Not at all.
It's something we need to actively protect and strengthen.
I completely agree.
So as we wrap up this exploration, I want to leave you, our listener, with a final thought.
Okay.
These alternate realities might not have come to pass,
Right.
but the underlying forces that shaped them, the economic anxieties, the social divisions, the global challenges,
Yeah,
they're still with us.
they are. And how we choose to address those forces will determine the course of our nation and the world for generations to come.
It's a big responsibility.
The future is not preordained. It's something we actively create through our choices and actions.
So thank you for joining us on this journey of exploration and reflection.
It's been a pleasure.
We hope you found it as thought-provoking as we have. Remember, the power to shape the future lies within each of us.